I am Shannon Maguire, and I am the author of Myrmurs. The overall trilogy, it's a medievalist trilogy where I do contemporary rethinks of medieval poems or medieval forms or medieval narratives. So the first book, Furl Parachute, is a radical translation of an old English fragment called Wolf and Edwacker. Myrmurs is the middle book, and in Myrmurs I take a form. I take the form of the Sestina, and I make what's usually a closed form into an open form, and play a lot with medieval formal elements such as the acrostic poem or other things like that, and I make a skeleton Sestina, which is just 6 lines and then 3 half like envoys, and I just use the end words in the Sestina sequence, and then in the final book, which I am working on currently, I take a Middle French poem called The Romance of Silence, like when translated into English, and it's a narrative. It's a post-Arthurian romance, and I take it into science fiction territory, exploring the body. In that poem, the question is between nature and nurture, and it's between is there a natural man and a natural woman, or is it about nurture? And there's cross-gendering and that sort of thing. So I just take it several steps further into science fiction territory. The ants are an interesting counterpoint to human city life because they are organisms that Deborah Gordon, who is a Stanford scientist, ant scientist, myrmecologist even, has written about the fact that ants are self-organizing structures, and in some ways, instead of the metaphors that we have accrued, such as the colony and that sort of thing, we should be thinking of ants more along the lines of being one organism, an ant colony being kind of a brain, and all of the individual ants within it being synapses or parts of the overall function. So they're really self-regulating systems. And so I was interested in that idea for languages and interested in that idea for human cities and for human modes of communication, and also having a radical outside to human ideas of life. And that's where the ants come in. The Sestina form is a medieval form that incorporates both secular love poetry and, in some ways, also a kind of protocol-based poem or procedural poem. And so it hinges on 6 end words in the traditional Sestina, and in my poem, it comes into contact with ants because ants have 6 legs. They run on 6 legs, and Sestinas run on 6 words. And so I have 6 long poems in Myrmurs, and they come into contact with each other the way that ants running around will come into contact with other ants and communicate that way, but also change direction and change their foraging patterns. And so the ants give the human impulse towards organization and hierarchical organizations, especially of like government forms and love, a totally different direction to follow. Normally, I don't know if Donna Haraway and Phyllis Webb would do well sitting next to each other at dinner, but maybe they would, because Phyllis Webb would just start interviewing Donna Haraway, and before you know it, there'd be like a whole other book that would come out of it. So I was like, well, yes, in a sense, this book, my book, is that dinner party, and there is the post-humanism or kind of radical openness towards like what is non-human, that gesture happening with ants in this case, at the same time as there's a real interest in form. And I think that I've borrowed some of Phyllis Webb's wittiness, or hopefully with or her fearlessness in approaching form without conforming to it. It's hard to start writing poetry in Western tradition, especially starting from a point of being an outsider in a lot of ways. It's because it's such a long tradition, and because there are so many formal elements and other elements, aesthetic elements and theoretical elements that come in. It's almost the idea that your silence to begin with is very primal. At least for me, it was. And so I needed a way to shake up the foundations a bit, to make room for the kind of work that I wanted to do. So I had to start at the very, very beginning in like Anglo-Saxon English, and work out from there. I love that question. I think that I'm not the person that can answer the question. I think that hopefully maybe readers could, but yeah, it's not a question for me to answer. This is a poem that is one of the partway through the pleasure cycle. And I also I'm thinking a lot about form, and I stole the overall form from Robert Crouch. So he has and but in his sad Phoenician, and I have awake, asleep, and then I get surrealism. Awake, Mum plants heritage tall grasses and wild flowers in the backyard, a prairie to cradle her after the surgeries. Asleep, our homemade lantern is hooked to the wings of needlewoman resonances. Awake, oak blue butterfly caterpillars transform ants into aggressive bodyguards with sugar droplets. Asleep, books written by friends sit on my couch and creep along the hallway beside the river, mixing their vocabularies into sugary droplets to caterpillar researchers into becoming their custodians. Awake, last year, they sent Mum home with a grasshopper brace after replacing all the knuckles in her paintbrush hand, and now her fingers trace sound lines in translation. Asleep, provocations, wetlands, woodsheds, and gravel pits are treatments that enrich our landlady's natural engine. Awake, draw a mascara circle the size of an avocado heart around the swollen bite, then be sleep's skillful temptress. Asleep, tide is rising, the sand now wet between your toes on the patio, and your waitress arrives offering maple braised snake instead of salmon, but you accept no substitutes. Awake, books are read, words swarm and touch, the cat licks all of the covers as the neighbor saws up the body of our tree and stacks the wood grown over 200 odd years against his fence. Asleep, A freighter carrying a butterfly spine the length of half a city block cries out to someone. Awake, the erotics of accidentally slamming one's own thumb into her passenger door are interrupted by the panic of having her drive off without noticing. Asleep, sky is fishnetted by stars' transitive drag. Along a bug-bitten false work of stomach, what counts as an object may cease to exist, i.e. breasts. And this is the very last poem before the tornado. Noise. An ant raft is a body female and continuous, where one worker ends and another begins, trapped oxygen buoys, making a crowd, a floating dialect of tiny writhing forms. A tree speaks to her ants in sugary lexemes. Dry spells protection this way. A city block is full of pavement ants testing their invisible territories. We need a better English word than colony to describe a measuring cup full of ants. An ant brain is an elastic snap of lines responsive bodies. And then I will end with the very first poem in the book, also called Noise, the first part. Ants move along the bricks, seem to be a species cleared for industrial charcoal. Nested inside the line's hollow stems, the myrmecologist foraging alone. Silent as we pass, their voices erupt at our backs. They can tell we are gendered dinosaurs. Marooned on a traffic island, burrowing into a cinnamon bun, empty Anglophone calories. Streets feed their secret boyfriends hard shells instead of skin. It's a new ecosystem. It's older than ketchup and mustard, older than the Chicago squeegee. Their eyes scald off our fish scales, blaming us for safe street acts, traffic control protocol, petroleum rainbows.